Executive Committee will come to order. We are convened as of 12:02 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I would respectfully ask everyone attending this meeting to please mute yourself unless you are recognized to speak. Please note that committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors are being held remotely via Zoom and will be audio and video recorded. The meeting recordings, along with the unofficial minutes of the meetings, will be posted as soon as practicable on the board's website. During today's meeting, we are providing communication access real-time translation, also known as CART. Anyone who would like to access this service should please send an email to the RTD Board Office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com, and a link will be provided. Additionally, the CART transcript can be automatically translated into Spanish for anyone who would like access to a live transcript of this meeting in Spanish. A live stream of this meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube page. I will now call for the roll of Executive Committee members. First Vice Chair Catlin.
Here.
Second Vice Chair Geisinger. She's currently absent. We'll note if she does join. Secretary Guzman.
I am here.
Treasurer Bouquet. Treasurer Bouquet is absent. We'll note if he joins as well. And this is Chair Davidson speaking. I am here. That is 3 committee members currently present and 2 currently absent. I'll ask the board office to please help me note any directors who may join. I see, for the sake of the record, we are also joined at this time by Director Lewis. Thank you for joining us. We'll now move on to the public comment period. I'd like to open up for public comment to anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic listed in the published meeting agenda for the current and immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and have not already done so, please raise your virtual hand or press *9 if you are joining by phone. During this time, the committee does not offer any direct comments or responses. However, if you would like to be contacted regarding your public comment, please email the RTD Board Office using the email address rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. I would also like to note, for the sake of the record, before checking in on hands being raised, that Director Tisdale has joined us as well. Thank you, Director, for joining us.
You're welcome.
And I will also note, for the sake of the record, that we are joined by committee member Second Vice Chair Geisinger. We now have 4 committee members present and 1 absent. Mr. Kroll, at this time, are there any hands raised for public comment?
Hi, Director Davidson. This is Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. At this time, I have no hands raised from participants who wish to provide public comment.
Okay. And before asking whether there are written comments to acknowledge, I'll first call on Secretary Guzman. I see your hand is up. You are now recognized.
Thank you, Chair. This is just a notification for office staff that the stream text is not working properly. I don't know if it's the wrong link or something else is wrong. Thank you. It is showing up in the Google document, just not on actual closed captioning.
Thank you, Secretary. I see nods from the board office. We'll work on that. Mr. Kroll, are there any written comments that the committee has received for today's meeting?
Chair Davidson, you did not receive any written comments specific to this meeting, but overall topics of note that were on previous agendas or will be on agendas soon. You all did receive a letter from Greater Denver Transit, which I forwarded to you all this morning, related to the Southeast Corridor light rail speed restrictions. And then you have also received a letter, which I will be forwarding to you all today, from Joseph Pero, who writes in about Tabor and has some opinions for the board regarding the potential referral of a ballot measure related to Tabor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kroll. With no other participants in the queue at this time, we will close the public comment period. We'll now move to the June board meeting agenda review. First, is there a motion to approve the regular June board meeting agenda for our regular monthly meeting on Tuesday, June 25th?
So moved.
I can second.
And as Catlin, the second as Guzman. Thank you. Is there any discussion on our June board meeting agenda as published in our packets? Yes, second Vice Chair Geisinger.
Yes, thank you very much. I would request, I was just looking for the agenda, that I think the first two items be removed from the unanimous consent. It's the performance scorecard. Is that on that unanimous consent? And then the other one is the Tabor vote, that those should come forward as recommended actions.
I would be supportive of that. Are there any other committee members that would like to comment on that?
I agree.
Thank you. I see a head nod from Secretary Guzman. Go ahead. Okay, great. See head nods. Okay, I think we're supportive of that. Mr. Kroll, can we proceed to a vote with that change being noted?
Yes.
Thank you. With that being adjusted, with moving two items from the unanimous consent into recommended actions, those being the performance scorecard and the referral of a ballot initiative. I don't see any further discussion, so I'll call for, are there any no votes on this action? Okay, seeing none, we'll pass with 4 yes and 1 absent. Okay, before we move to our discussion items, and we do have several today, I'd like to just remind everybody that we are going to have 2 special board meetings next week in addition to our regularly scheduled board meeting. The first of those will be on Monday, June 24th at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and it will be to discuss the agency's progress to date and plan moving forward related to the speed restrictions on the Southeast Light Rail Corridor. The second special board meeting will be held on Tuesday, June 25th at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, prior to the regularly scheduled board meeting for that evening. That meeting will include 1 action item. This is for the board to commit to annexing portions of the town of Erie into RTD should the voters of that region vote affirmatively this November to join the district. However, the primary purpose of that special board meeting next Tuesday will be to partake in an executive session to discuss the findings from the Office of the State Auditor regarding the 2023 to 2024 performance audit. This will be an important conversation, and I certainly encourage all board members to attend in person for that discussion. With that being noted, we'll now move into our discussion items. We do have 5 discussion items on the agenda this afternoon, with the first item being the monthly government relations report for June 2024, which will be presented by Mr. Michael Davies, our government relations officer. Mr. Davies, I'll now yield the floor to you. You are now recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer. With regards to the government relations report, I'm going to start at the federal level. Really, the focus has been on trying to move some of the annual appropriations bills. So there are some committee actions set up both at the subcommittee and full appropriations committee on the House side. The Senate side is not scheduled anything as of yet. It's looking at the full calendar through the rest of the fiscal year. It's a little difficult to see how Congress is going to be able to get through both House and Senate and negotiate a compromised package. So we'll be watching that closely, but there's a chance that we'll end up with a continuing resolution to continue funding the federal government. But we'll keep the board up to date when we start seeing some of those bills coming out on the annual appropriations process, which will come out right around the committee hearings, and that's the first committee hearing being June 27th, and then July 10th is the full House Appropriations Committee scheduled. So we'll keep the board up to date on that. Lastly, at the federal level, it's informative watching the authorizing committees hold hearings on matters of transit importance, as it kind of signals what Congress is thinking about for the next reauthorization bill. So there was a hearing on June 12th regarding Amtrak and intercity passenger rail. Not too much relevant there. Frankly, a lot of the focus was on the pay and incentives of Amtrak executives. So not a lot of talk on actual grant programs and actual projects. The other hearing was on June 13th, and that really was on the Highway and Transit Subcommittee, and a little more relevant toward transit policy. And the title was Revenue, Ridership, and Post-Pandemic Lessons in Transit. A lot of the focus of that was really focused on kind of the welcoming transit environment for customers that have been really reported around the nation. And so, the safety of both operators, safety of in-transit employees, as well as safety of customers while utilizing transit. So we'll continue to follow the work of the authorizing committees and make sure the board's up to date there. Moving over to the state side, really staff's effort at this point has been focused on understanding the implementation process of some of the state legislation focused on funding transit and passenger rail. Frankly, that passed last legislative session, specifically with regard to Senate Bill 230. As you all know, the Clean Transit Enterprise Board really is charged with implementing that those oil and gas production fees that will go toward funding transit. And so the Clean Transit Enterprise Board has their very first meeting since this legislation has passed on June 27th from 2:30 to 4, and staff will report back on what's there. I don't know if they'll be specifically talking about firm actions, but I anticipate there'll be some discussion that will be informative of how that board will implement that legislation. And it's also really important to just understand that, those fees that go to fund transit don't start getting collected until July 2025. And so really, I think the very first opportunity for the Clean Transit Board to have funding transferred to them and contemplate how that then goes out really wouldn't be until January 2026. Again, staff will be working closely and monitoring the actions of the Clean Transit Board and working with the staff of CDOT who staff the Clean Transit Enterprise Board. Lastly, just touching on local matters, RTD, myself and staff continue to actively engage in working with our local municipal partners and making sure that we're communicating clearly. On Tuesday, May 28th, General Manager Johnson, Director Whitmore, and myself attended a study session with the Brighton City Council. And there's been some follow-up action and conversations with Brighton City staff just to further collaborate and make sure we're working in partnership and responding to comments we heard from council during that session. On June 5th, I joined some staff from Front Range Passenger Rail at the Parker Chamber of Commerce just to really talk about a summary of the legislative session, and some members of the city council were also there, and it was a good discussion and helpful to engage with some folks in Parker. And then lastly, on June 13th, RTD staff, including myself, joined the City of Aurora staff, and really this is a kind of a quarterly engagement that we really have with the City of Aurora staff, and that's just to make sure that we're all on the same page and aware of all updates. So just wanted to make sure the board was aware of some of those engagement activities. Lastly, I just want to make sure the board is aware that we've been actively communicating with all elected officials at all levels with regards to the Southeast Corridor service and repairs, and we'll continue to do so. going forward. So with that, that concludes my report, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davies, for the report. Thank you for continuing to communicate with our elected official partners and for the engagement at all levels, federal, local, and state. Are there any questions for Mr. Davies? Yes, First Vice Chair Catlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have a question. I just wanted Mr. Davies to be aware that there was a meeting that was convened by Andy Kerr from Jeffco up in Evergreen, and I attended, as did Susan Woods from staff. And at that meeting were presentations from CDOT and Jefferson County Road and Bridge, as well as Representative Tammy Story and Representative Brianna Titone. And a number of people were there and talked a lot about transportation issues. So I just wanted you to know that that was conducted, and it was a Saturday morning, so it was, but I don't know if that was on, obviously it was on somebody's radar because Susan Woods was able to attend. And as usual, she did a wonderful job. So just wanted to give you an update. Thank you.
Thank you very much, First Vice Chair. Also, I'll note for the sake of the record, we have been joined by Director Ruscia. Thank you, Director Ruscia, for joining. And next, I'll go to Treasurer Bouquet.
Just wanted to say, first off, thank you for all the work that Mr. Davies has done. I just want to let you know that the Parker Chamber of Commerce has really appreciated updates from you and your staff talking with them as have the town council. I also wanted to raise my hand to point out for the state of the record that Treasurer Bouquet is also present, and I appreciate you allowing me to come in late. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in my mind, I noted that on my paper, but I don't think I did out loud. So thank you for stating that for the record. Much appreciated. Are there other questions for Mr. Davies? Okay. Seeing none, well, Mr. Davies, thank you for joining us, and as always, giving us a thorough summary. Oh, I do see Director Ruscia's hand is up. Director Ruscia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have repeatedly requested that we be copied on these communications with elected officials, the general ones. Is that something that we can do? I get forwards from elected officials on our communications with them, like, for example, the legislature. And so I think it would be really helpful for the board to see them as well, so we know what's being said and how things are being framed. So I feel like at this juncture, I just need to put it on the record and make a formal request. I don't know if that requires a director initiated action, but in the past, we did receive copies of those reports, and that is no longer the case. So is that something that we could just briefly discuss here at this meeting and maybe come to a conclusion?
And Director Ruscia, are you referring to anything that would be in written communication?
Well, ideally, we would get summaries of communications, written or not, but written communication would be a great first start. Again, we don't have a government relations committee anymore. We have this committee, the executive committee, but I do know as a matter of practice that those communications with the board have dropped off. So a copy of the written communications as a minimum would be very much appreciated.
So Mr. Davies, I'm wondering if I can call upon you and just ask the question, when you, using as an example, the most recent communications you're referencing, would you mind just sharing with the committee what types of communications, what forms of communications were entailed in some of the most recent, for example, those concerning the Southwest speed restriction?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chair. This is the first I've heard of that request. I have no issue making sure that I pass that on to the board office or this committee. I'm happy to work with you and the committee in any way that's helpful.
Director Ruscia, please go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. To be very clear, I'm talking about and copying to the board at large, not just a subset of the board.
Thank you, Director Ruscia. So I'll commit to conferring with Mr. Davies on the types of communications and modality and what's going out, and work on what the best mechanism would be to share with the full board. So thank you. Anything further, Director Ruscia?
Just we've discussed before. Mr. Chair, would you mind just whatever your determination is of what you feel is the best mechanism, would you mind communicating your decision to the board at large so that we
Sure.
have a follow-up? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep, no problem. Okay, seeing no further hands raised for the government relations report. Again, Mr. Davies, thank you for joining us. We will move to our second discussion item. This is for the proposed bylaw amendment to allow the chair to appoint committee members in the event of a vacancy. And at this time, I will call on Mr. Jack Kroll, our executive manager of the board office, to present this item and to thank him for his work in identifying this gap and need and assisting. So Mr. Kroll, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chair Davidson, and a big thanks is also due to General Counsel Snyder, who did some work with me between when this item was originally scheduled to be discussed at last month's meeting and today. And what you are seeing today is a slightly revised version of what actually was supposed to be discussed last month, but was tabled. So I'll just point out that the article that this would be slated to move into has shifted based off of General Counsel Snyder's wisdom and input on this, from being in the committee sections to being under the chair section to being in the committee section of your bylaws. And she also did some great work to help clean up some of the overly verbose language that I was using. So I want to give her a lot of credit for helping me with this. Basically, though, this is really straightforward. It just empowers the chair to make appointment to a committee for a board member who might join after the executive committee makes its initial committee assignments for the year. So that would resolve the issue we had this year with Director Lewis, who came onto the board and was effectively not able to serve, although he could certainly attend on a committee for about a month. The other thing that this would help cover and resolve is situations that may arise where a committee fails to, it's known in advance that a committee will not be able to produce a quorum. Now, certainly we poll directors for their availability, and there are regularly scheduled committee meetings, but there have been instances in the not too distant past where committee meetings had to be scuttled because there was not going to be sufficient quorum. This bylaw change, or bylaw amendment rather, if supported by the board, and again, it's just a discussion today, but if supported eventually by the board, would allow the chair to appoint committee members for purposes of ensuring a quorum. That way you don't have to skip a committee meeting. This was a practice that we used very sparingly, but on several very important occasions when I was on the Board of Regents at CU, and I think it's a good practice to introduce here, given the amount of time, energy, and effort that goes into producing and preparing for committee meetings. You really don't want to be left in a situation where, because the board can't muster a quorum, you have to scuttle all that work. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or concerns, but it's pretty straightforward. Oh,
Sorry, I was on mute there. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kroll, for presenting that and for your work on this. And General Counsel Snyder, thank you for your work as well. I'll go ahead and call on directors with questions now, starting with committee members. Secretary Guzman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The amendment language that you have in the packet that we have received states, in the event of a vacancy arises after the board's ratification, comma, the chair shall. Is it the chair of the board or the chair of the committee? And do we need to delineate that and make it clear who which chair we're talking about so that there's no confusion there? Because that's confusing to me.
Sure. We can just spell out,
Mr.
it's supposed to
Crowley.
be the chair of the
Yeah.
board, and I think that's just a little bit of a change that came over. We were able to really cut down on a lot of the language by moving it from the chair section to the committee section. So I think it was self-evident as it was initially introduced because it was under the chair section. So we'll just make that slight adjustment there.
Thank you, Secretary, for the clarification. Not seeing other hands from committee members, I'll move to other directors with questions, starting with Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering whether and I have not looked at the amendment, and I apologize for my lack of diligence in that regard, whether the amendment would also contain that same ratification language that, in other words, after the appointment is made by the chair, that the board would then, as it does with the other members of the committees, ratify the chair's appointment.
Director
Mr.
Tisdale,
Crowley, would you like to comment?
Sorry, Chair Davidson, for jumping in. Director
go for it.
Tisdale, that is correct. With respect to a situation like that which has arisen or that which arose with Director Lewis, his appointment would be subject to ratification in the event of appointing a board member, say, to ensure a quorum for a specific instance of a meeting. That would not necessarily be subject to ratification. However, by default, the committees cannot, in what's the word I'm looking for? The committees cannot compel RTD to take an action. Only the full board can. So in effect, once the full board acts later, it's in effect ratifying any decisions that committee may have made at that time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. Thank you, Mr. Kroll, for the answer. Director Ruscia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a clarifying question and then a comment. So my clarifying question is the intent of this amendment to say shall or may? Like, are you implying that the chair will do something, must do something, or that they simply have permission to do something? And I bring this up because we have, our bylaws say that committees can have 5 to 7 members, I believe, at least for performance. And so last year there was a vacancy in performance, and I will just disclose that I requested to be appointed and that was declined, and that vacancy stayed open. So are we saying that vacancies, must be filled and that they will be filled by a chair upon ratification? Or are we simply saying that the chair can fill that vacancy?
Mr. Kroll, would you like to clarify on the
Sure,
intent as you drafted?
I think the Director Ruscia raises a good point, and I think it's the bylaws, as you have stated, Director Ruscia, indicate that standing committees shall have between 5 and 7. So my sense is there's not necessarily an obligation for the chair to appoint a director to fill a vacancy. However, it would be pretty odd for the board to welcome in a new director, but then not afford them the opportunity to join a committee. So I would say that while it is not necessarily mandatory as Director Ruscia has pointed out, it falls closer to mandatory than optional. I mean, I don't see how the board could really get, why would you welcome a new director on and then not put him on a committee? But there could, in theory, be a situation whereby an existing member simply resigned from a committee, as Director Ruscia indicated last year, and the chair wouldn't necessarily be obligated to fill that seat. So given this discussion, I think the language would be cleaner if that word were changed from shall to may, but I'm open to further input on that.
And at this time, I'll go to General Counsel Snyder, whose hand is raised.
Oh,
you're on mute, General Counsel.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to point out we're on packet page 18. So if the language does currently say if a vacancy arises that the chair shall appoint. So if the intent is to make it optional, we should change that to may. But with respect to the temporary appointment, so if a board member is not able to, or a committee member is not able to attend a committee meeting, that language just says that the chair is authorized to temporarily appoint. So that one is a really clear, in my mind, a may as to the temporaries, but right now as drafted, it's a shall as to the vacancy for a committee member.
Thank you, General Counsel. Director Arusha?
Thank you, sir. So on that, I would, and I respect what Mr. Cole is saying, how we're talking about two different potential situations. And if I misread the bylaw proposal, that could also be the case, but I had assumed it would apply to either situation that I raised, or that has been raised. And so I just wanted to offer that we could also, because it is odd to have an even number of board members on a committee in what would be considered a permanent situation, right? So we're not talking about one meeting in where we might, we're struggling to reach a quorum, or even we just have an even number of board members. We could state that, for standing committees, we have to have an odd number of individuals, because that kind of relates to what happened last year. But anyway, I also had a comment, if I may, on the idea of a temporary appointment / question. Is this really to address quorum, or is this to address any issue in which a board or two members might not be available?
Director Arusha, meaning, can you clarify of the not being available? Can you just clarify your question a little further?
Sure. So we can have, we could have a committee meeting in which a director or two directors might be absent, but we still have quorum for that committee. And so what I'm asking is this bylaw change intended to ensure we always have a quorum, or could this also be used just when we don't have a full body present? And I ask because I, again, wanted to understand the intent. I think when, this is just my feedback, when there is a quorum question, it becomes more important. But if it is just a matter of a committee member might be absent, then I think, given that we have a small committee structure and the size, I don't know if that is necessary, and that could be interpreted. And I'm not saying that that's the intention right now, but that could be in the future interpreted as, something more political. For example, in other legislative bodies, it's called stacking a committee. I don't think we do that here, but I don't want us to get into a situation where it could be interpreted as such. So that was the context and feedback for that comment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Director Arusha. So we have two threads here. I want to come back to the thread on may and shall, but on this thread, thank you for clarifying the question of the absence. It is certainly my understanding that the intent is quorum, because that is a challenge that various committees have faced in the past. As Mr. Kroll highlighted, it's been a little while, but has been a challenge. Mr. Kroll, are there any comments you would want to make further on that, or does that capture the intent?
Yeah, I just point out that there's the beginning of the third sentence, which begins to deal with, the beginning of the, third sentence of the proposed bylaw amendment states to ensure a quorum. So that is the intent, and I think it's pretty clearly defined.
Thank you, Mr. Kroll. That was going to be my next question, was whether that did the clarification we needed it to, which General Counsel Snyder, I would ask you, does that cover us for clarifying the intent?
Yeah, I think that plain language speaks for itself, that's to be used only to be able to ensure a quorum.
Great. Director Arusha, does that address your concern, comment, question?
It did, thank you, and I might have just been reading it out of order or not with the red line. So thank you for that. And then I guess I regarding may or shall, I would just offer that we whomever is bringing this forth, and perhaps you, Mr. Chair, like just get that clarification before we vote on this, so we don't take up time at the meeting itself sorting that out. Thank you so much for your considerations.
Yeah, thank you, Director Ruscia. I actually did just want to see, and it's okay if not now, and please feel free to communicate it directly to me or to the board office, to Mr. Kroll, but do any directors, committee members, or other directors present want to weigh in on their preference on may or shall? And again, no need to now, you can follow up, but I'd recognize anyone who wanted to comment at this time. Okay, seeing no hands on that, Director Ruscia, I will commit to working with Mr. Kroll to make sure we have clarification around that. And I would ask any committee members and directors that if you do have a strong preference on that, to please communicate it. I do think that there are several factors in that, which, as you had pointed out, Director Ruscia, the odd number of committee members may be one. So we'll seek that clarification, make sure that's in place, and look for any feedback from directors on that. Thank you. Seeing no additional hands raised at this time, again, thank you, Mr. Kroll and Ms. Snyder, for your work on the suggested bylaw amendment. I think that will be very helpful. We encountered this situation this year, and I think this will serve us well. Moving into our next discussion item, this is our third item. This is with respect to board to staff communication and requests for information and or work product. And I will briefly comment on this to start us off, and then next open to First Vice Chair Catlin if there's anything she would like to share for consideration, and then next move to our board office executive manager, Jack Kroll. This is with respect to improving or enhancing the board to staff communications. And you'll see in the board report, there are a couple of things that are written for the consideration of the committee and the board here. I'd like to call attention to the first paragraph in the discussion item. This is on packet page 31, which states that as we seek to refine and improve our communications between board and staff, there are really two lenses to look at this challenge through, or really two problems that we're solving for. I think the first is a relatively simple one, which is respect to the basic decorum and the values that our board expects for directors to uphold in their communications and interpersonal interactions with members of staff. You will note in the packet there in the past have been prior resolutions that the board has adopted, suggesting that there have been times in the past when we need to further commit to our values, which of course this board in August 2021 adopted agency values of passion, respect, diversity, trustworthiness, collaboration, and ownership. That's one lens I think we want to bear in mind as we consider board to staff communications. The other lens is managing the volume of requests and determining how to prioritize requests. Something that is relatively, there are two things that are fairly new to the agency this year. One is our agency response system that I'd like to thank, again, the board office for working together as a team to roll out and implement, which allows us to consolidate and organize communication requests and information requests coming from directors to the agency. That being a new process, I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are best utilizing that process to increase the transparency of communications and organization of it. The second thing that's relatively new to the board is, of course, our work plans, which perhaps gives us a framework to consider how we prioritize requests that are placed to staff. When we're in the presence of a high volume of requests, as the agency is working on this, I think it's also incumbent upon us to think about how can we help staff and direct staff what to prioritize and what to answer, which of course upcoming votes on policy matters or discussions on important policy matters are areas in which directors will need timely information going into committees and meetings, whereas other requests that may be less pressing or immediately tied to our work plans may not require the same level of response. This is not going to be, I think, perfect when we first do this, but ultimately something that First Vice Chair Catlin and I had discussed early on in looking at the agency response system was perhaps adopting some changes or a formal policy. I'll give credit to Director Tisdale for suggesting that one of the best places for us to look there could be our board operating guidelines, where we, as we've amended earlier this year, we adopt guidelines of how we work together with each other and how we work together with staff. And what I would propose for consideration is that we again amend and update the board operating guidelines to have some more explicit policies and framework that help us ensure, on the one side, that we are honoring the values the board has adopted whenever we are communicating with staff and determining what that might mean. So for example, when communications are delivered and to whom they are delivered. And then on the other hand, how to utilize our agency response system, organize and consolidate requests so that the agency is best able to manage it and ultimately create some framework for prioritization. So those are things that I had wanted to open up for consideration. I think what we're trying to accomplish today is hear feedback from committee members as well as any directors that might be present of what's important to you as we think about board operating guidelines, what should be reflected in terms of communication with staff, both what we would expect the board to provide to staff in terms of values and organization, and what we expect to receive in return as well. I think that's the kind of discussion that we'd like to have here. But with that, before moving forward, I'd like to open up the floor to First Vice Chair Catlin if there's anything at all that you'd like to add at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You summarized it very, very well. I think what you and I talked about, or some of these requests seem to be requests just for the sake of requesting. And you and I talked about having a discussion about to what end, what are we trying to solve with this request? And how is it in keeping with not only the board values, but also with our work plans and moving forward in prioritization. So when somebody makes a request, I think they need to really articulate for what purpose and how this information will be used. That was the only thing I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, First Vice Chair Catlin. Yes, and I think those are exactly the types of things that'll be great to capture as it's a great example of things that we might want to capture and state as we consider board operating guidelines. At this time, I'd like to ask Mr. Kroll if there are things he'd like to add. One thing that is also wonderful about having the agency response system is we can actually look at data in terms of requests coming in that can inform us all as we think about prioritization and organization of communication. So, Mr. Kroll, I'd like to acknowledge you at this time for anything that you would like to state, and again, just honor not just your work, but the work of your team in creating a system that can give us this kind of information. So, Mr. Kroll, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Davidson. And I'd just like to first start by recognizing a lot of the hard work that went into creating the new agency response system was done by Jillian Knapp Rhodes, who really conceived of this issue or conceived of this system and has worked diligently with staff across the agency to get it to where it is now. There are still features that are coming on it and being rolled out, but she's done a great job to get us to this point, and her work certainly is deserving of recognition. One of the things that is, I think, important in the context of all of this is just the cumulative impacts of each request. Each request in isolation is probably very valid and certainly something that directors ought to be interested and intrigued about. But it's when you put all of those together that you start to begin to see the cumulative impact of the requests. And we have some data that I just want to share very briefly here. And this is a bit of a screenshot, so if I need to zoom in here, I can. So this is just an example of, and this just, I think, frames this more contextually too, right? And we're not talking about any one director or group of directors. It is just a cumulative impact of all of the requests are reflected in these numbers. So you can see the total number of requests that were sent in by directors in 2022 is 114. You can then see we saw a 68% jump in those last year to 191. You can now see that between the systems that we've been running this year, we had the legacy SharePoint system produce 71 agency response requests. And now Salesforce is up to 150. And those are numbers, I know there's some different numbers in your packet, but these are numbers as of today. The board office did a lot of work previously this week to get all of these numbers updated. And this is the number that I really want to draw people's attention to, is right here, which is the staff hours just on these 150 requests, the staff hours that have been expended since March. And now these are not just board office staff hours. These are staff hours across the agency. And so if you agree with the assessment that we're roughly halfway through the year, and you just take some simple math and you gross these up to say if the first 6 months of the year are identical to the next 6 months of the year, not an exact science, but a calculation worthy of seeing the results of, you can see where we're projected to land with just under 1,000 staff hours committed to managing requests from directors across the agency. So I wanted to provide this data and as a way of giving you all some context for where we are and where we're headed. One thing to note and qualify this data with, we did begin to track more things in Salesforce than we were tracking in SharePoint. But nonetheless, even if you account for the increased tracking, you can't say that, that increase that we're on pace for, which is 131% increase over last year, is entirely attributable to, just us tracking more things. There has certainly been an increase in volume. And I think, Director Davidson, that's all I would like to add at this point. The board office, I guess I'll provide one more additional piece of context. The board office stands at the ready. I mean, we do our best to get these out into the right places. I think it's been asked, does the board office have enough resources? Kind of to be determined on that front. But what I would say is we're not the ones in many of these instances that are providing the responses. These responses trickle down elsewhere across the agency and have to be responded to. And so from an administrative perspective, in tracking these and staying on top of these and reminding staff, that's where the board office can come into play. Certainly at times we really want to be a mile wide and an inch deep. And if we can handle some of these requests and get information out the door that's accurate and factual, we're happy to step in and assist staff in that. But we're not going to be that way for most of these requests. For most of these requests, they're going to have to filter down. So it's not as simple as just saying the board office needs more staff and we'll get all of these responded to faster. It really is systemic. And, what we didn't include in these data, but I can tell you from just having reviewed all of the ARs so far, is they're hitting every area of the agency. It's not isolated to just say bus operations or rail operations. It's communications, it's government relations, it's budget and finance, it's the executive office, it's HR. And so that's what needs, I think, to be accounted for as you all consider what your options are moving forward to address this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kroll. So with that, I'd like to open up for discussion from board directors. My intent today is to listen very carefully, along with First Vice Chair Catlin, to the feedback that we hear in terms of what's important and what ideas that the board has to potentially update our board operating guidelines to enhance and improve our board to staff communications. And then I will be committed to working with First Vice Chair Catlin and General Manager Johnson and her staff to understand what's important to them as well, to then make recommendations to this committee in July for consideration for us to act upon later in the summer and into the fall. So with that, I'd like to open up for any ideas that board directors have. Certainly one that I heard first Vice Chair Catlin states is that in our communication stating the why, the intent of what it is that board directors are seeking. But are there other things that directors would like to communicate as being important, or ideas to refine and improve our communications between board and staff? Treasurer Bouquet, please.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of when it comes down to getting the why, of these requests specifically. I think also prioritizing it, that we have it where, hold on real quick. Sorry about that. I think also not only prioritizing the why of it, and prioritizing when it comes down to constituent questions, because a lot of the time I'll go to the board office staff because there's questions that constituents that are potentially going to have, and I might not have the answer to. So I think when we're making our director requests, I think we have to look at it as the view as directors, as we're basically the communication channel. We're elected. Our bosses are the people. Our bosses are not only the people who are writing our system, but also our community members. We get our jobs based on voters. So our main priority is ultimately fulfilling the requests that we are hearing from our constituents. So I think that should all, I guess this would more like a PSA when it comes down to all of my fellow directors is, yes, we can have our individual requests, but also think about what capacity we're asking those requests for. So again, prioritizing it when it comes down to, hey, I'm hearing from a constituent, or I'm hearing from constituencies regarding, in specifics, the speed of the E-line train, is one that I've heard from a lot of folks. That's what we should be advocating for and requesting. I think that as individual directors, we should think about prioritizing always their community members. And when we're hearing from our community members, submitting those requests. And then of course, if we're getting it from customers or our constituency, I think that's what we should ultimately be prioritizing when it comes down to staff time. I'm not sure, that might have just been a PSA, Chair, but I think that's a message we should kind of think as individual directors is, hey, we're the mouthpiece of the community. That's our main focus. That's our main priority. We're obviously policymakers, but at the same time, we need to be prioritizing when we're hearing it from the community. That needs to be told to staff. So that would be my little PSA there. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer. And you triggered a thought that I've had along this line, specifically with this. One thing that the agency response system also gives us the benefit of is having that information be centralized. And one thought I've had is ensuring that communication goes out to all directors, because it almost builds a repository of understanding. And a lot of constituent questions come in, can be quite similar. So once that's been answered, I think it can help directors create an answer and send an answer to a constituent without drawing on staff time if we've had a prior answer. And perhaps there's something to be said about prioritizing when it's a constituent answer, making sure that's gone to the full board, so the full board then can put that in our back pocket to be able to use without drawing on staff time the next time there's a related question. So I know I'm addressing something you brought up. I'm curious, Treasurer Bouquet, if you had any reactions to that, since I'm building off of your idea there.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I think that if it is like kind of centralized I guarantee it that other directors might be individually having their communications with the folks that they know on a personal level. So I would love to hear, what are potentially responses that are getting, sent back out. And so maybe I can have answers for the folks that reach out, who are my constituents specifically. But I think that's a great idea, having it more kind of centralized when it comes to answers. So I think the big point is, common theme is we're the voice of the people. That's our goal as directors, and having that making sure that the constituents have a way to actually talk directly to staff. That's our main goal, in my opinion. So, but no, I love that suggestion, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer. Secretary Guzman, please.
So, Jack, I will follow up with you in an email, but I see some just general spelling errors that we can clean up on this. Broad versus board requests being one of them. But here's my take on this, and I'm going to be very sincere. I've struggled with this since I joined this group. When is it appropriate to ask a question? Because this feels like the pushback, and I think to Treasurer Bouquet's comments, there are some things that come up that are really individual. A bus stop here, a bus stop there in my district, but they're all bus stops that are not under RTD's auspices. And so I have a general answer I can work with and a place to begin. But then if I send all of those to staff and we're too busy tracking down bus stops, well, I know we have a bus stop study going on. Does it make sense, or can I take a crack at trying to communicate with my constituency and say, hey, this is really what we're looking at, and I need you to be patient while we finish the study, then we'll have more information. So I don't waste staff time and I handle what I can on my own. And then sometimes it's bigger things than that, right? So I think that determination, and what I found is working with staff, working with, Taishrei or Jillian, or with Mr. Kroll in the office, here's the question I'm getting: is this an appropriate one to send in? How do you want to handle it? There's often really good feedback, and like Jack said, a mile wide and inch thin, we know some basic answers and we can start that conversation with our constituencies. But I don't want to be shy about asking questions when they come up, because I'm worried about all of these. And so I think that inhibits the ability to be a good representative of my community. It also creates real or perceived a sort of opaqueness in our ability to answer and be honest and be truthful with the community about what we're serving. And I don't personally think that we're not being honest and forthright or transparent about anything, but I do have a concern that if we limit questions that come in and we're not routing them the right way, that's an issue. It could also just be part of ongoing training and expectations as we learn how this system is tracking things, that we add that in for understanding for all directors to continue forward. There's some things that are relevant, some things that aren't, right? Opinions that make no sense and nonsense comments that come in from the public that are attached to emails that are clearly not valid emails or not true emails that was created for the purpose of creating an argument. I don't engage with those, and for very good reason. If you want to have my attention, time, and you want me to take time away from really studying our packets and doing the work that you sent me here to do, then put your name on your comment. Otherwise, it's not worth the time to read it, and I don't need to respond to it. I feel that way very strongly, and I've talked to several people in my community about that. When they feel they haven't gotten the response they want from an email address that is clearly designed to create a problem. Finally, on this, I would say, back to the beginning of this particular discussion item, I appreciate very much that you and First Vice Chair Catlin looked at this through the lens of our commitments and our mission and values, because it's really important. And I also appreciate having the 3 attachments about the resolutions on how we are expected to go forward and achieve this. So that said, those resolutions, probably some of that language needs to make its way into our expectations in a more direct manner. And I would be fully in favor of that, because there is a process there by which, if something goes awry, if some communication is not correct or true to form, that we need to take action, and we need to deal with that with immediacy and the strongest sense of urgency, because we can't allow that to happen. A toxic work environment is not good for anybody. It creates a toxic board environment. None of that is helpful to doing the mission of the agency, which is, making lives better through connection, and that creates disconnection and that creates chaos. And so thank you for the hard work and thank you for considering it. But I also would like to see this move forward in a more substantial way, where we don't have to go back and look for several different resolutions. We have those resolutions and those expectations clearly laid out in our guidance materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Guzman. And I just want to make sure that I've captured some of the things that you've shared before moving on. So I heard that certainly there's this open question of prioritizing questions and, how do we do that? When is the right time? I think that is some of what we can address in here. I think, I'd invite anyone to comment on frameworks for that. I think the work plans occur to me, informing decisions at upcoming board meetings occur to me. But then I heard a second part of what you had to say, which was in line with what Treasurer Bouquet did, which is honoring and prioritizing thoughtful comments and questions from constituents. So I'm kind of hearing that as a theme and something that me, work in. I think we need to create a, framework for the types of questions we want to address. And I did hear your comment about constituents being a part of that, as with Treasurer Bouquet. And then finally, I heard your comments on the values. And I like the way you framed it as, rather than having all these resolutions that sort of get lost to time, then we're digging them back up, consolidate those. Another, good benefit of potentially doing that in our board operating guidelines, where I think it would make sense for our values to appear. Have I captured everything that you had to share, Secretary Guzman?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to move to committee members first, and then I'll move to the other directors here. So I'm just going to jump to First Vice Chair Catlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is a little bit delicate, I guess. I've had some constituent requests and have forwarded on to the board office and everything. And then what I found is that oftentimes, or not oftentimes, on a few occasions, those requests have been taken to staff, and then staff deals directly with the constituent. And that troubles me a little bit, along the lines of what Treasurer Bouquet said. We are supposed to be the liaison from our constituents to the agency. And in that, I know there's been directors have been discouraged from talking directly with staff for reasons that, a lot of the reasons that we're trying to solve for here. But I think sometimes it is really beneficial for there to be a liaison role from the director to staff and to the constituent. And I've talked to Jack about this a little bit, that I don't want it to appear that a director is passing the buck. And that's kind of what I've had some feedback on constituents that, well, you just turned it over when they wanted to deal with me. I'm not being very articulate, but that I think we need to really give some thought to how some of these issues are managed. So that's just an opinion. But I agree with with Treasurer Bouquet that we really are a conduit for the constituents to express or to get answers. So thank you.
Thank you, First Vice Chair Catlin. And perhaps there's an idea in there that's a win-win. I mean, perhaps I know we have this high volume of requests, and certainly one thing we receive a lot of our constituent requests. I wonder if there's the win-win of, if the board is seeking to be liaising and owning that role of communicating with constituents, again, as we build out a repository or get those answers, perhaps there's some process we could work out with the board office by way of answers coming through Salesforce and going to the director to use, and then being available to other directors, so that we are able then to use those and ideally chip away at maybe the volume of requests over time. I guess just since I'm thinking out loud here off of your idea, but I'll pause and see how that resonates with you based on what you're sharing, Vice Chair Catlin.
Yeah, I think it's going to be iterative. I think some of this will be trial and error. I just know that I have one thing pending right now, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with it. Yeah, I appreciate that win-win approach, and that's sometimes we as an agency have been labeled the agency of no, and in getting to yes with some constituents and some creative thought, I just want to make sure that we are allowing ourselves to do that as directors. Thank you.
Thank you, First Vice Chair. Thank you to the patience for other directors. I'm going to finish out the committee comments, and I will go to Second Vice Chair Geisinger, please.
Thank you very much. I share some of the concerns that are raised, and it seems like there are kind of two categories: the information that directors are looking for, and then the constituents. And the constituents, it does seem like it's a little trickier. I like the idea of having some sort of repository. I don't know exactly how that would work. Another way to deal with some of that would be, and this might be all of the questions, to have a regularly scheduled, semi-annual study session or something where people can talk about their questions and maybe answer them within the board. One thing I've found helpful when I get constituent comments, and if they're service related, we'd like the FF4 back, we go into Civic Center, or the GS, the Golden to Boulder, or whatever it is that I think the most effective way to get that to staff is to have that person send it directly to the service.changes@rtd-denver.com. I always tell them I can send this, but it matters that they're hearing from the public. So on that, I know it's a small piece of what our constituents are asking, but it's a regular thing. And I think getting people to understand that. I also think there's kind of a hearts and minds step before we go to operating guidelines. And I agree with Director Guzman, going back to look at some of what these previous resolutions were and seeing what we want to put in the guidelines makes sense. But also, this is just really good information. And seeing Jack's numbers, was 130% more that we're on track for this year. And just saying to people, think twice about whether you need this and whether you need it right now, I think is an important step in this process, because it's easy to sort of get focused on something and say, oh, let me see what's happened on this, when maybe it's not something that needs to be addressed at this point. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Second Vice Chair Geisinger. And just again, to make sure I'm capturing everything, the delineation between director info and constituent, I think you outlined really well there, and talked about perhaps having other opportunities to have meetings where we discuss key open questions. And then you mentioned the referring of people. And I agree. I think that's a great point. When it's service related and even some other customer experience issues, sometimes the best, fastest information is sitting with those official channels, and maybe just knowing where to send constituents could be helpful. And then I love your comment about the, thinking twice. And this is something I've been reflecting on a lot lately is, prior to sending emails and notes, is thinking, to what extent do I need this, to what end? And Mr. Kroll, thanks for highlighting that cumulative effect being one of the items we're solving for. So thank you. Second Vice Chair.
One more
Please.
thing, because you sort of triggered it. That works so well for service changes. Are there other things, like you mentioned, consumer complaints or, things? Is there a way to have an email that those go to so they are being seen by staff? And we need to believe that they're being, seen and taken to heart. But I do think with service changes, that having the number of people who are writing in go there does seem to, to be an effective, at least a consideration for the staff. And so maybe there are other topics that we could treat the same way, get a separate email. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think, Mr. Kroll and First Vice Chair Catlin, I'll take a note that perhaps something we can talk about is, where to refer constituents, and maybe there's even some process of CC so that, the director can follow along, but, kind of taking care of and directing that traffic. I'll take that down as a note of something to look into. Thank you, Second Vice Chair Geisinger. And I'll round out the committee comments here with Treasurer Bouquet.
Thank you for the second bite at the apple. Just real quick, I just think respecting staff time at the same time, and I just want to thank you all, board staff, you guys are incredible, and I love the work that you do. Respecting staff time, and also at the same time, if we're answering questions to constituents, and we know the answers as directors, this also needs to be reported to staff because of the power of the weight of the voice of our constituency. If we are hearing complaint after complaint or feedback after feedback, this needs to be documented somewhere, because it clearly shows that not necessarily we need to give an answer to it, or if we as directors are giving an answer to it, this also needs to be weighed so that full-time staff are also aware that this is what we're hearing from folks. Because I truly believe in the weight of voice, and we need to make sure that that is documented somewhere. And if it's a big enough concern that we're hearing this from so many constituents, it's something that needs to be addressed. And so that's my last point with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer. Understood. And Second Vice Chair Geisinger, is your hand still up from before? Or did you have something further? Okay, great. Thank you. We'll move to other directors now. Thank you for your patience and for joining us at the committee. I'll start with Director Ruscia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have several comments and I'm happy to copy and paste from the transcript so you could reduce your note taking, sir. So first, respectfully, I just need to say that I want to opine that even putting out the idea that directors are requesting for the sake of requesting is not appropriate framing for this conversation. And actually, it's contrary to our current board operating guidelines, which advises us to assume best intent. So, I'm asking fellow directors to be careful when we have this conversation. It is sensitive. But I think to question if a question is appropriate is the wrong path. And it is the agency's job to answer questions from their governing body. I don't need to tell the agency why I'm asking a question, although I often do. But even when I do that, that's been reprimanded. Second, if we don't have enough staff, we can hire more staff. For whatever it's worth, the board office actually used to be larger in terms of staff. And that was back when we had, I think 80% of the constituents we have now. Third, I personally ask questions that I need to do my job. And usually what I do, almost as a matter of defense, is to state we used to receive this information that we do not receive anymore. And that is because I'm told I ask too many questions or take too many bites of the apple. And I've been accused of asking questions just for the sake of it. There isn't a single question that I have asked via email or in a board meeting that I would take back or I regret or I didn't need an answer to. And so, we've talked about this before, and I'm not talking, and my comments here are not directed at the board office staff because this is outside of their auspices. But, I think management needs to consider that they have a job to communicate effectively. And that means giving us information that we need to make informed decisions. And a lot of times that information can just come up front. I think we have moved in a better direction with having discussion items, but that would absolutely reduce director inquiry, both in writing and in meetings, and just make us all more efficient. I think we have all been at the place. I know we've all been at the place where we've gotten the memo responding to a director inquiry, and that memo came during a live committee meeting, right? Or board meeting, or 10 minutes before. And that was directly related to an item on the agenda, often an action item. And so that is something that the agency needs to address. And that's not on us to ask fewer questions or spend an exhaustive amount of time figuring out how we could get an answer more effectively or get information more effectively. And then fourth, I just want to state that, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me continue here. The level of requests that we're getting or that the board office is getting might correlate to agency performance, which is in need of improvement. So if we're seeing a spike in constituent inquiries, then that might be an indicator that we need to improve. That could be an area of customer service. I know for me, I sometimes my first inquiry from a constituent can be, I have tried to talk to customer service multiple times. And then so they're already upset, right? And then I feel like I have to do something, even if it is just respond in a different way that customer service did or the agency did in a way that shows the constituent they were heard. But, you know, as it's been brought up, like the Southeast Corridor is an obvious example of where we're going to get, you know, more inquiries. On-time performance is another. If our bus on-time performance is at 83%, we're going to get more inquiries and we're going to forward them along because it's not something a director, you know, can really directly address, especially if it's a certain line. And then fifth, we have 3 districts, A, B, and C, that are higher ridership districts. And I don't just mean the top 3, but disproportionately higher. And that includes mine. And so we're going to get more inquiries. You know, when we did training, we were told to go to the board office when constituents reach out. And so, you know, sometimes I don't need that level of handholding. I can answer the question. But again, sometimes this is a specific customer service or line, you know, a bus or light rail or commuter, whatever, like a specific issue that there's no general answer. So I just want to also note that too, if there is a sense that some directors are making constituent inquiries more than others, just by level of volume and who rides our system, that is naturally expected. And I have also had that issue of like where I'm worried I'm passing the buck, but it does concern me when I'm not CC'd on a response, because then on my to-do list, it looks like an open task. And so I don't know how that has to work on the tech side, but I would really like to get CC'd on those responses when the agency, when it is appropriate for the agency to directly respond to the constituent, like especially if it's something, you know, say related to Access-a-Ride. And then, you know, I don't know if this is somewhat related to what we're talking about here, because I think inquiries can also be a request for staff time. And not every director gets the same amount of staff time, whether it is a town hall, a community meeting, or a government relations meeting. And so I think this is something that we need to take up again, maybe in a retreat, because we want to make sure that we're being fair and equitable. But again, you know, we have that reputation of being the agency of no, and we have had a reputation for many years of being non-transparent or non-responsive. And so while I understand what we're trying to solve for, which I think is the board office time, I think the framing that we're using and the approach needs reconsideration, because we're elected board. We are supposed to govern. We don't work for the agency. We work for our constituents, you know, between 200 and 225,000 of them, depending on where you are, and we're supposed to govern. So respectfully, I believe that us exhausting time governing each other's speech is not going to yield the purported benefits that we're seeking right now. And so anyway, I know I said a bit. I had some comments typed out, and Mr. Chair, I'm happy to just send those to you directly. But this has bothered me for a bit, and I just think that especially with the issues that we're facing right now with state of good repair in the Southeast Corridor and service disruptions that are to come, we need to tread carefully in this conversation about regulating each other's speech. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Director Rucha. And it's important to me that I capture everybody's feedback here. So I'll just state back a few things that I hear. Assuming best intent for the questions that are asked by the board. The note was made about potentially increasing board office staff size. I think that would be one thing I think could be very informed by continuing to measure the responses and the staff time and delineating the staff time draw. So I think some of these things we'll just need to, you know, kind of learn as we measure. You mentioned that it's helpful to have discussion items before recommended actions. And perhaps even there's something we can capture along this as we consider a good path forward. I agree that tends to improve how familiar we get. And I think especially in finance and planning, that's been very helpful over the past few years. You mentioned the level of request potentially indicating information about the agency and its performance. I think, again, that's something that as we measure over time, perhaps is something we can take a good look at, those requests. The timing of answers I've highlighted as something you noted that responses coming from staff being during or right before an action would be taken. I've taken a note there that perhaps there's another win-win in there for us to sketch out expectations around timeline of when board members will ask the question and then when those questions would be responded when it's informing a vote like that. You mentioned the idea that some directors may need more request time due to having larger ridership within the district, which I've kind of highlighted as another area that is important for us to measure the cumulative, I think, rather than looking at an individual director level. And then you mentioned the CCing on responses as something that would be helpful when it's a constituent matter. So I'll just pause and make sure that I've captured the actionable things that you had shared there. Anything you wanted to react to in my restatement there, Director Arusha?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think you captured that pretty well. I just, again, want to emphasize that, you know, we be very careful when in our framing, you know, when we suggest that someone is just being an argufier or asking a question for the sake of a question. And, you know, I don't want to take up too much time and dialogue on what you meant, but you had said something about looking at the cumulative. I guess I would just offer, you know, we used to get customer like reports that about customer service inquiries or complaints, and that was for fixed route, but also for Access-a-Ride. Those used to be in the monthly board reports, and so, you know, maybe that is also something that's a point of data we should be receiving again. You know, especially if there is a way for us to know it, you know, to see those patterns. Like Treasurer Bouquet said, you know, there are some issues that we expect we're going to get a higher level of inquiry, like right now, the Southeast Corridor. But there might also be things that are systemic across the system that directors aren't aware of, or even just in an area, and that needs to be shared. So I just wanted to offer that, you know, we're really meaningful in what data that we're sharing in terms of the numbers, right? So thank you very much. And again, I'll follow up in email.
Thank you, Director Arusha. I'll now go to Director Tisdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I am more than happy to defer to Second Vice Chair Geisinger as a committee member if you'd like to go to her first, and then I will be happy to make my comments.
Oh, thank you, sir. Second Vice Chair Geisinger, would you like to go?
Thank you. Either way, it's fine. I just had an idea from what Director Arusha was saying that I was going to agree with, which is that, you know, we're talking about a performance scorecard. I'm hoping we're still setting KPIs and putting more information. I think there is some information that we used to get that is dropped away, and I think potentially raising that level back up will help with this issue as well.
Thank you very much, Director Geisinger. Director Tisdale, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A number of the points that are being made are already addressed in the existing resolutions that we have, some of them going back to 1986, as is reflected in the board packet. Specifically, the 4-hour rule, the 2-hour rule, and the notion of everyone being civil in their discourse. So those are already addressed. They can and probably should be incorporated expressly into the board operating guidelines to make it clearer, not only to the board members, but also to others in the general public as to the expectations that we have of each other. The other issue that has come up is the communication directly with staff and just peppering staff with communications. And a lesson that I learned and shared when I was a mayor is one that I shared with the board chair earlier, which is when you're a city councilman or the mayor, and you have a problem with the Public Works Department, you don't complain to the Public Works Department. You complain to the city manager, and the city manager is to resolve that problem. If the city manager doesn't resolve that problem, you don't fire the Public Works Director, you fire the city manager. And that's how these things are supposed to be. And I think for any board, that's a good model. So I think we could articulate in the board operating guidelines that any requests for information that directors have should, in the first instance, be addressed to the general manager, CEO, with a copy of that to the executive manager of the board, who is the gatekeeper for all of these requests. If the response is not made timely and satisfactorily by the GM CEO, having referred the matter to someone with knowledge as to the issue, then the issue is with the general manager CEO, and that should be brought up accordingly. You don't discipline the AGM who's involved relative to this. You, in fact, communicate your dissatisfaction with the GM CEO. But it begins with the concept that these communications are to the GM CEO with a copy to the executive manager of the board. There is an exception, and the interim policy, if we can call it that, that was sort of unilaterally decided, did not address, and that I think we need to make sure we articulate. And that is, if there is an item of information or an emergent problem, you're on the train and you notice something, in that instance, then communicating that with the relevant AGM is appropriate. But other than those pure informational items, hey, I wanted you to know that I saw 50 people lined up at a train station, and we didn't have adequate room in the car for all those riders because it was some event or something, to bring it to their attention. That's an informational item. An emergent item would be, gosh, we just found a delay in service because there appeared to be a temporary electric outage. Just wanted to make sure you were aware of this. An emergent problem, you bring that forward. But I think if we articulated that in the board operating guidelines and incorporated the existing resolutions that we have, that would go a long way toward addressing many of the concerns that have been articulated here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. And as I've been doing, I heard three major things here. I'll echo back. There's, first of all, examining those prior resolutions as included, and not reinventing the wheel where we don't have to, but perhaps memorializing some of those and bringing them forward into a document that stays up to date with the board operating guidelines. The second being routing communications through the general manager and CEO in the first instance, with a CC to the board office executive manager. And the third item being carving out where there are exceptions, which you noted, emergent informational issues and the respective AGM. Have I captured the items you had wished to share, sir?
You have indeed, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. Director Lewis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ex-mayors think a lot alike, so thank you, ex-mayor Tisdale, for those comments. I just wanted to give you my perspective. Coming on in January, I knew there'd be a lot of stuff I didn't know and things I needed to learn, but I kind of looked at the picture and realized I couldn't ask all those questions in 1 week to staff, so I spread it out over a period of time, and I hope that's a good lesson for all of us, is that when we do ask a question, put a priority on it. When I send in a request to Jack's office, I usually say, hey, I have a meeting and I need some subject matter stuff, low priority, take your time. And then there's other things where I say, I need it right away. So I think staff would appreciate that. My second issue or comment is that when I do respond to a constituent, if it's something I feel that maybe other board members could use, I usually send it back to Jack Kroll and his crew, so they can use that. You know, if they see the same theme coming up, they're more than welcome to use my responses. And I'm hoping I didn't give that a direct communication with the office, but I hope they can do that. And I think that was brought up earlier about if we have a consistent issue, that we have a consistent response. So if one of us has a really good response to a constituent, let's share that with each other. The only issue that I do have, I disagree with is you guys were saying the why. And I think that's a really sticky approach. Right now, I would rather use the word specificity, if I could say that right. Be more specific in your request. Don't ask general questions, which would take up a lot of volume and time. The more specific you are, the better you are. Getting into the why, I have a feeling that when we send those questions into department heads, that they might see that that is a threat to a policy that maybe they support and I don't. So saying why and going into real specifics, I don't think is necessary, and I would not do that. But I would be specific in asking what I want and not be have any ambiguity. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lewis. I heard some 3 actionable things here. One is suggesting the sharing of priority. 2 is having consistency in responses and perhaps leveraging the board in that we may share with each other when we've had good responses that we can leverage. And the third being maybe perhaps not suggesting as much the why to the what end, but just being very specific. Perhaps, you know, another way to say it is to the point and specific around what it is that you're seeking. Did I properly capture everything you had wanted to share? See the thumbs up. Thank you, Director Lewis. Very much appreciated. With that, I see one more hand. Director Arusha.
Thank you, sir. So I want to just say thank you, former Mayor Lewis. Put a priority on it, please, if we have one. I'm finding I'm not always getting responses in a timely fashion to something that is time sensitive, even when I do put a date on it. I don't put that on the board office, but if there is a way in Salesforce where that can be a field, maybe that helps in triage. But I mean, I just had an issue where I waited 3 weeks for an answer that I really needed for an R&O meeting. And I might have sounded very passive aggressive, but I had to just finally respond and say, or, put the query back out and say, okay, I have to let, several dozen community members know that I put in the request the day it was asked and I didn't get a response. I did then get a response about, and 50 minutes before I was to leave for the community meeting. And it was very community specific and policy specific and related to specific lines. But I don't put that on the board office because, as noted, the board office is an intermediary more often than not. So maybe there is a way we can do something on the back end to ensure that that our expectations can be met, as it relates to things that are time sensitive. And then I also agree regarding the mayor versus the public works department or a specific department. So thank you, former Mayor Tisdale, for that as well. So I would just offer 2 suggestions for this committee and for the chair. The first is, where I work, we have a policy that if you're on the 2 line, you are expected to do something. If you're on the CC line, it is an FYI. And maybe we just need to set some general guidelines on like, what is a meaningful email, I also used to work in a marketing department where we had forms for just like quick text forms, like to help us when we were making a request or offering information so people could get what they needed very quickly. And since we are not filling out something in, say, Salesforce, that might be a helpful tool for everybody. So I just want to offer that for consideration, you know, emails that matter and, you know, all the way down to the subject line. And the second thing is, so I understand we have policies that sometimes are and aren't followed and resolutions that have been written as far back as 1986. We also have directors that weren't even born yet in 1986, and our population was significantly smaller. And, you know, I'd kind of be remiss if I didn't note that some policies regarding speech and time were subject to litigation at one point that ended up being costly to the agency. So maybe this is a board retreat topic. And instead of just memorializing previous practices, we take a fresh look and come in as a team. So, you know, we can just ensure that we are, you know, meeting the needs of the time. And of course, that's for the board and the executive committee to decide, but I would just offer those two suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ruscia. And I'll note you mentioned twice the retreat topic, and I do think that's something I would recommend for consideration in the next retreat. I think that's a good idea that this be discussed, and it's a good place for that to continue. Great. Well, thank you everybody for sharing your feedback. I've taken some notes. I'm committed to work with First Vice Chair Catlin, General Manager CEO Johnson, and Board Office Executive Manager Kroll as we consider the path forward. Mr. Kroll, thank you again to you and your team. You gave a shout out to Ms. Knapp Rhodes. Thank you, Ms. Knapp Rhodes, for working on this and getting to this point where we can measure, we can manage what we measure. And I think, as has been stated by several directors, this will be iterative and we'll learn as we proceed. So I know that was a lengthy topic. I appreciate it. I think our next two discussion items will be more brief. I thank everybody for your patience on this. It is an important matter. So we'll close out our third discussion item and we'll move to our fourth at this time, which is respect to new director onboarding and continuing education for directors. And at this time, I'll just briefly open the floor, and then I'd like to see if Mr. Kroll would like to add anything further. This is a relatively simple discussion item at this time, because the real questions on the table are, should we and can we all agree to create a policy that would formalize what our board training would be for both newly elected directors being onboarded or newly appointed directors in the case of a vacancy, and also for ongoing education. I think if the answer is yes to that, and if everybody is amenable to creating a policy that we would have in place, the next question, as I would propose, as we've done on other items, designating two directors to work with our board office executive manager and his team to develop such a policy that would formalize the training of new directors as well as the training of ongoing directors. There are many topics I think we'd want that team to look at that perhaps folks would want to weigh in here, such as the topics, particularly for ongoing training, and the where and the how for ongoing training when we do have very full schedules throughout the year in what is a part-time role. So I would like to just open the floor to directors once Mr. Kroll has spoken on the primary two questions of, do we agree we want a policy as a board? If so, are folks comfortable with the path we've taken of having two directors work on that? And then if there is anything you'd like to add. With that, Mr. Kroll, I'd like to open the floor for you if there's anything you'd like to fill in or add at this time.
Chair Davidson, I have nothing further to add at this time. I think you've encapsulated the discussion item appropriately. Happy to take any questions or comments as they arise.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Kroll. Secretary Guzman, please.
So I would like to volunteer myself to participate in this as a director, but here's the reason why. The Latinos in Transit Leadership Academy, we have a capstone project, and this is the subject matter of the capstone project I'm currently working on with a director from Chariots in Salem Keizer, Oregon. And we are working across the country doing research on this very topic about what needs to be trained, how you do continual training, and what training could look like, should look like, who's doing what, and what are the best practices. And we're leveraging contacts at different agencies, from SEPTA to Links in Orlando to LA Metro, RTD in-house, and what we're doing here to do a cross overview of what's happening throughout the nation at large and small agencies. And so I think it would be helpful, since I come with that knowledge and that research in literally on my laptop, to be able to continue that conversation. But I think that this is something that we should probably figure out how we're going to do. And every agency does it a little bit differently or a lot differently. And I can proudly say that we are very well trained here, and we believe in those opportunities to receive enrichment in our knowledge and understanding of how public transit works, especially because not all of us come from a transit background as elected representatives on this board. And so we do need to get caught up on some of that information. And the one question that I would consider very heavily is, when changes in the law happen, how do we ensure that we're updated on that properly? And no joke, our agency is on top of it, and they provide that information currently to us, I think, through the best ways possible. But we're basically like herding squirrels sometimes. So trying to figure out what a timeline looks like and what a best practice could be for all of us could come down to just we record those sessions and we can review them, or when we need to review them because council has brought us something, or the subject matter expert for the government audits have brought us something that's been updated and changed, or best practices for finance. That's all stuff that we can keep track of and disseminate amongst board members who may not be able to reach a training at that particular time. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you for offering the thoughts, Secretary, and thank you for volunteering. I won't make any commitments here. I'll give some thought to folks who have been through some of our trainings, as well as folks who are working on training issues such as yourself, and we'll give some thought as to how to form a team around this. And thank you for offering those thoughts, Secretary. Very much appreciated. Director Ruscia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also just wanted to indicate a desire to work on this. I did go through the experience as a new director, but I also used to be a teacher, and I have a license in this matter, and I have done corporate training. So I would like to also volunteer myself for consideration. Additionally, if this is a thing that is where a lot of directors have interest, or it's of great importance, we might also benefit from having a very temporary ad hoc and just kind of power through some of the big ideas. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Director Ruscia, and as with Secretary Guzman, thank you for volunteering. If folks seem supportive of that approach, that's the approach I'll consider, is putting 2 directors on this. I think it sounds like it makes sense for us to have a policy. Any other thoughts from directors, committee members? Mr. Kroll, please go ahead.
I would just like to ask, in the interest of time, I don't think it'd be particularly fruitful to get it here, but if there are specific topics for onboarding and training, that those topics that directors have in mind be shared. In the board report, I did list the trainings that were provided last year during the onboarding process. But if there are topics for next year's class of directors, as well as continuing education and opportunities, please send those my way. I'd be very curious to compile those and assess how we can fit that all into a schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Kroll, for offering to consolidate that. And if directors could submit any topics of interest to Mr. Kroll, that would be very, very helpful. Thank you. We'll proceed on working on a policy, and I'll work with my fellow directors in the board office to get that activity underway. We'll move to our final discussion item. This is 2-year committee appointments. This may be relatively brief. I'm one of the directors who had flagged this of interest in the past. And this interest certainly for me came out of the work that was done going back some number of years on the ad hoc audit committee when we were overhauling the audit committee. And we had a lot of discussion around continuity and we had a lot of discussion around the development of institutional knowledge over time and the importance of retaining that knowledge at any given time on a committee. Recognizing audit committee is quite a bit different than some of our other committees in terms of how critical that institutional knowledge is. It's not quite an apples to apples. But I wanted to share a couple thoughts and then see if anyone wanted to offer any additional thoughts, given that this is on our work plan. I think the benefits, if we were to entertain taking our smaller committees to a 2-year appointment, is that there's a greater opportunity for directors to develop expertise and institutional knowledge in a particular area, which I think gives an increased concentration of that knowledge and offers it some, then that plays into some continuity. And then it also helps build some consistent relationships between members of staff and members on the committee and builds out that continuity. There certainly are some drawbacks. I think there's, an increased likelihood if we were to make a move to have 2-year committee appointments that directors would remain on a committee that perhaps their interests or expertise do not align with, and particularly if we were making that decision with newly elected directors before their feet are underneath them. Sometimes we make some shuffling at the end of the first year once directors see where perhaps they're best aligned. There's also the potential for election cycles to disproportionately impact the membership of a committee and perhaps not have as many open positions that we'd have to contemplate. And then I think, there's not really, perhaps we're not solving for a problem that exists because there's not always a lot of fluctuation between the committees anyway at this point. Why I certainly would offer that if we were to do something like this, I think executive committee would deserve its own carve out. I think it's important for us to examine how important the leadership is at each year of the board. Why this may be a relatively quick conversation is, although I've had a lot of interest in where this might be an improvement, I think we're at a point in the year and in our election cycle where it's inappropriate for the board to take action on anything like this until of the board, as it will be in 2025, has had a chance to consider this. So if we were to do anything, I would think it would be to perhaps do some research and work to frame up what a good bylaw adjustment would be, if this is even something that we think we should solve for, and offer that up to the next year's board. I think that's the most we would want to do, and not actually adopt something ahead of our new colleagues. But it's also perhaps something we may or may not decide to solve for. And that's what, given this is on our work plan, we've moved it once or twice. I wanted to open this up for discussion to hear if directors have any particular leanings one way or the other about taking this on in what is already a busy year, and what thoughts you might have. So I'll open the floor now. Treasurer Bouquet.
Yeah, I think first off, I do agree with the timing of it, that this probably isn't going to be a decision of this current board, as we're currently in an election cycle. The one thing also that you brought up, Chair, that's just really good is, what are we solving for? And the question of why. I think that is really where we should be guiding ourselves and leading it to when it comes down to what I heard was, hey, we want to develop expertise potentially. I also would just be cautious or throw out the point of, are we going to be restricting directors, having to fall into the 2 cycles that they have? Can they get a wider expertise, serving on multiple committees? Is that the, director's desire is to, go deeper into, one committee compared to, serving on several committees and learning a wide range of knowledge, but maybe not at the same depth? I guess that would just be where I was leaning is, one, figuring out what are we solving for? Okay, if we're going to be going forward with that, what are we trying to do ultimately? And then 2, are we going to be ultimately restricting ourselves or future directors when it comes down to potentially what their passion, what their interest might be? And again, it's a discussion I think that's more appropriate for the 2025 board. So thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer. I appreciate the thoughts on that. Always good to anchor to the problems. I'm going to go stick with executive committee members first and then move to other directors. So first, Vice Chair Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the timing with Treasurer Bouquet and with your suggestion that we might want to wait. But But I also wanted to point out that oftentimes these committee assignments are self-regulating. If a director has a passion, they may choose to continue for a second or maybe even a third year in that particular role. So I think maybe gaining or getting the pulse of directors next year would probably be appropriate. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, First Vice Chair Catlin. I appreciate that very much. Move to other directors. Director Tisdale, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Respectfully, a solution in search of a problem and timing, obviously, as has been indicated. Thirdly, I learned years ago from my late wife, who was a municipal law expert, that there are 3 rules of municipal government. We've never done it that way. We've always done it that way. What do other cities do? Those are the 3 rules. The first 2 are really kind of make-weight rules and shouldn't be considered. But the third one, what do other cities do? We've answered in the board report. We talked to Go Triangle, Greater Cleveland, JTA, LA Metro, San Mateo. I think everybody likes the 1-year pattern. So do I. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Tisdale, and thank you for pointing out that part of the packet, and thank you, Mr. Kroll, for assisting in that research and ensuring that was in there. Very much appreciate it. Director Ruscia, please.
I concur with Director Tisdale, and that's my comment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Director Ruscia. And Secretary Guzman, please.
Just quickly, I see the value of having this conversation, but I also think that we have a process right now where we get to say, you know, I'm really interested in this aspect or that aspect. Not having been on the operations, safety, and now security committee before, I really do like the finance committee. So that would be where my heart is at. Although I'm not fazed by moving to a different committee should the need arise. This year, you know, after my first year, I finally have my feet under me, so I know more what's going on in the routine of things. And so it does help to stick around for a second year and get a good, healthy understanding of where we're doing. But that's also driven me to get, as you've said, the education, right, and more pertinent knowledge regarding how our finance and planning system works and where I need to focus on if I'm going to be effective in that committee. There are other committees where this might be a deeper consideration. For example, it's a different process to go through the audit committee. To be a member, to serve on there, you have to have certain skills that has to go through an interview process. And once you're on that committee, it would seem, if you have the amount of time left in your term and the willingness to do it, that may be a committee where we would want to keep 2-year commitments so that that work can continue properly. Performance is a committee where, you know, everybody could have a turn, you know, on the board, providing a key role in performance committee, but there is a continuity issue there with what happened the previous year to what's going on in the following year to keep things moving along, both for the purpose of having familiarity with the general manager CEO, but also with the agency key metrics that we look at. And so it's not an all or nothing. Maybe it's a both and. I think that conversation's valid. But I think, you know, it may not apply to everything. And I think for our regular standing committees, having movement amongst the executive committee, everybody gets an opportunity to you know, move into a position of leadership. I think that's good because we are all leaders in our way and all of us have different styles. And so, you know, if there's a desire or a need to have somebody continue something that they started, you know, Angie Rivera Malpiede was chair, I believe, 2 years in a row during the pandemic. There was work that clearly the board thought needed to be continued in the chair that was elected at that time. I'm sure that's happened before, but it still went through regular process according to our bylaws. So I don't know. It's kind of and how do people feel? Take the temperature, maybe. The rest of the board might want to weigh in on this first.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary. I appreciate it. I think hearing the conversation and the research, and I'm grateful to Director Tisdale for pointing it out, that the phrase that comes to mind, first Vice Chair Catlin put this really well, that there's a self-regulating nature to this. And, you know, this is actually a conversation, and I thank Director Tisdale for the invite, or, you know, one of the APTA conferences, board member conferences that I had attended, I had this conversation with a number of directors, and many do serve on committees for, you know, multiple years, which makes sense based on expertise. But it does appear that that's not necessarily a bylaw function that is self-regulating, and I think that is the term that best comes to mind. And when we were tackling audit, we were in a different realm in that we were looking at, you know, best practices and guidelines from the Institute of International Auditors, and the expertise being a key requirement. In fact, even something that had been brought up multiple times by the Office of the State Auditor in historic reports. So I think we were solving for a different problem. I think based on the nature of the conversation I've heard here, we just end this discussion and not move this even to the next board. If the next board decides that it's something it wants to bring up, that I think is fine. But yeah, I think I hear a lot of consensus around the solution searching for a problem, and that self-regulating this is the best way to develop the experience and move forward. So any objection to letting this one fall by the wayside? All right, not seeing any. We have checked that off our work plan. I appreciate everybody for engaging and considering it. Finally, we'll move, we're complete with our discussion items. We will move to other matters. Are there any other matters to address? Yes, first Vice Chair Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I received a email from Director Lewis, and thank you very much. And this was in response to a request from the Performance Committee that if there are any metrics that you would like to see in the dashboard or the scorecard, to please let me know, or let members of the committee know. And so I did receive a very thoughtful email from Director Lewis, and I just wanted to encourage other directors to forward those as well as we move forward. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, First Vice Chair. I appreciate the reminder on that, as I'm sure we all do. Director Ruscia, please.
Hello, sir. Thank you. I have a couple. So the first is regarding the minutes and our current procedure with minutes. We have moved away from a different format that we had in just recent memory. Like, we'll say like so-and-so spoke, but we don't say what they spoke on or what the topic was, but we refer to a transcript. And while referring to a transcript is allowable and permissible under Colorado law in terms of record keeping, I would just ask that we commit to looking at best practices when recording minutes, because this is a public transparency issue, and I don't think it's fair to just refer people to a YouTube video or a transcript. So that's something that I think technically falls under Secretary Guzman, but I wanted to bring it up here because, you know, it is something that will also help with other board members when reviewing minutes or, you know, of other committee meetings prior to a board meeting. And it also keeps us all apprised. So I think just in terms of efficiency, we could use some enhancements there. And I'm addressing you because you're the chair, but I also recognize that might be under Secretary Guzman's auspices. Related to that, and related to information sharing and who is in charge of what, we don't have a book of resolutions and actions that is public facing or even accessible to directors. And I know, and I apologize because I don't want to cross dialogue. I know Secretary Guzman has brought this up before. And I am just asking that, given we are in June, can we just set a date at which this will be made available to the board and the public? I feel like if we don't put a date on it and we don't name it, we don't commit ourselves. So I think the board has to create its own KPI in that regard. So I just want to bring that up, and I don't think it'll be solved today, but I just wanted to put it on the record. Again, it's really imperative that we are compliant with statute. And I also think that would reduce some of the inquiries coming from directors and help with training if we just had access to those items. And it will help us in creating future resolutions as well, knowing what we're currently bound by. And then finally, on digital accessibility compliance, I've brought this up a few times. And again, I'm asking formally right now that we set a date for a policy and practice in which we will come into compliance. So for example, like our dashboard right now that we just put out is not compliant with state law. And our packets are often non-compliant because we have things like tables, which are images, but they're not readable for those who use screen readers. And so the legislature has extended the date for compliance by a couple of years upon request. And we are now at the point where we must have formal policy within the next month, I think. But we really, I think it's incumbent upon us as the policy setting body to, again, set a date, write it down, and make our own KPI just to ensure that we're reducing risk to the agency in terms of potential lawsuits, but also being respondent to the expectations of community. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rucha. And I saw some hands go up that I think are in respect to at least one of the first two items, if not both. I'll start with Secretary Guzman.
So, excuse me. Thank you, Chair. Can we meaning you as Chair, Executive Board Office Manager Kroll, and I set a time to meet about these points? I have gone through the training. We do have the resolutions available. They simply need to be requested, which is the formal process, and then they can be produced. As far as a physical book, because we did have a resolution to move to a paperless situation at RTD, it has gone digital. And so that is in effect. However, there is the legal component there that we do need to address. So maybe General Counsel Snyder might be able to advise us later at a later date on some of that to ensure that we have what we need properly to fulfill our requirements. And the second thing that I would point out is that all three of those do technically fall under the auspices of the Secretary, but I would not act alone in those. I would need to work in conference and cooperation with all of you. And so it would probably be best to set a meeting to handle each of those items separately and then come back with the solution, the date that we would need to have that completed by, etc., what has been asked here. But as Secretary, I'm willing to do that. So I will make that commitment, and we can find a time to do that at some point if you are willing, or whoever you delegate to be the other party in that, so we can ensure that we are meeting those requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, for offering that. I would be committed to having such a meeting. I will consider whether I need to delegate on that one. And just something to bear in mind, I think, is this is, I think, where we will have some value in our work plans as we move into the next year as well, about how to align work plans around the goals that we set, recognizing that the board oversees the board office, executive manager, and our general manager and CEO, and set those goals. There are things we can establish and consider for refinement. So something I just want to reflect on is where that fits in work plans, how we set ourselves forward on that. That's something we can dialogue in a meeting about, and thank you for your offer to do so. Mr. Kroll, I see your hand is raised. Did you want to speak on these matters as well?
Yes, just very briefly, Chair Davidson. I want to address a couple of things just to ensure everyone is aware of what the current situation is. The board office, as Director Guzman has pointed out, does have records of all of the resolutions and things that have been passed previously. So I don't want anyone to think that nothing exists. We have it. We were actually asked this morning to do a little research for the General Counsel's Department. We located a resolution from 2003, several resolutions from 2003 that could be beneficial to an action the board may take next week. So we very much have this information. It's here. I have gone through a training with Director Guzman to show how how we have access to it, and then anything that he needs, we can certainly produce for him quickly. Second, with respect to accessibility issues, we took Director Ruscia's feedback very seriously, and I had some work done. I partnered with Michelle Merz Hutchinson, who's a Deputy General Counsel, as well as Gabe Christie, the ADA specialist in the Civil Rights Division Office of Civil Rights. And they have reviewed our board packets and board website and provided some feedback as to how we can make those more accessible. And we have in turn passed that feedback along to staff and are flagging certain issues that Director Ruscia has brought up. And the final thing that I want to mention on this is we are in the process of procuring a new board paperless packet software. This is going to be a cloud-based software. We hope to have something implemented by the end of the year, beginning of next year. We again worked with Civil Rights, ADA, and the General Counsel's Office, and have very specific expectations for vendors who are going to be responding to that to ensure that they comply with those enhanced accessibility requirements. And as part of that process as well, we are looking for a vendor who can migrate a lot of our historical data to a platform that is accessible. And so these are both issues that are on the radar for the board office. And I believe, and I am confident in saying that we are tracking towards optimal solutions for addressing both the accessibility piece as well as the historical context and ability to access those records.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kroll, for addressing all of those items. Very much appreciated. Director Ruscia.
Thank you. Quickly, sir. I just wanted to ask that we also raise the digital accessibility question with our advisory committees before we finalize any actions internally or formally. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ruscia. All right, not seeing other hands. Before we adjourn, I'll note that the next executive committee is scheduled for Thursday, July 25th. The committee's work plan calls for actions related to the proposed bylaw amendment we discussed today concerning vacancies on committee, as well as our property and station naming policy. Additionally, we're slated to discuss our audit committee member appointment process, something that came up today, starting to plan for our 2025 retreat. Again, some things that came up today. And as always, we will hear an update from our Government Relations Officer, Mr. Davies. Thank you very much for everyone's patience and participation and engagement today. Seeing no further discussion, we will adjourn this meeting as of 2:09 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you.